In Italy, there was a day that forever marked the history of justice. It was the 23rd of May 1992. At 5:58 p.m., an explosion tore through the highway that connects Palermo Airport with the city. 500 kilos of explosives made the Sicilian ground tremble. Judge Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 bodyguards were killed instantly. The land of the mafia had just declared open war on the state. The man responsible, Salvatore Totò Riina, the supreme boss of Cosa Nostra. 55 days later, history would repeat itself. Another explosion, this time in the very center of Palermo, ended the life of Judge Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's friend and colleague. 2 attacks that not only shook Italy, but revealed the face of a man who believed himself untouchable. For months, a group of investigators transferred from Milan followed his steps with surgical patience. On the 13th of January 1993, after years of silence and fear, they achieved the impossible. They watched Riina's wife leave the building, and 2 days later, the boss himself. When he was arrested, he was wearing a simple wool vest. He looked like an ordinary businessman. But behind that modest appearance hid the most feared man in Sicily. With his capture, 24 years on the run came to an end, along with an era of terror that had left hundreds of dead in its wake. Totò Riina, the son of a farmer from Corleone, had managed to control the entire island through blood, fear, and silence. His arrest marked the end of a manhunt and the beginning of a truth that Italy has yet to fully digest. 2 months after his capture, Totò Riina appeared in public once again. The chosen place could not have been more symbolic, the Palermo courthouse, where 6 years earlier he had been sentenced in absentia to life imprisonment. That morning, the boss of bosses seemed to have rehearsed every gesture. He wore simple clothes, like a farmer coming to defend his honor. He walked slowly, head lowered, projecting an image of humility that contrasted sharply with the legend of cruelty surrounding him. Before the judges, Riina spoke in a calm tone. He denied any connection to drug trafficking and to the power structure known as the Commission. He claimed to be nothing more than an honest farmer, the son of farmers, a family man, and a devout believer. He stated that his only commission was his home, his wife, and his 4 children. He pleaded to be understood as a man of faith, not as a criminal. His speech, carefully calculated, sought to construct a different character, that of a humble worker who attributed his destiny to the will of God. But behind that tranquil voice stood the architect of a war that had soaked Sicily in blood. The same man who ordered the execution of judges, generals, journalists, and anyone who dared challenge his power. Totò Riina presented himself as a believer. But for Italy, that aged face represented something more than faith or poverty. It was the reflection of the impunity that had ruled the island of Sicily for decades. Totò Riina projected a deceptive image. At first glance, he appeared to be a simple man, with calm manners and courteous behavior. He spoke in a soft, almost paternal voice, as if seeking to inspire trust. That apparent humility was his most effective mask. Beneath that serene demeanor hid a will of iron. Those who knew him understood that his calm was not a sign of peace, but a silent warning. Riina did not need to shout to impose authority. A single glance was enough for others to understand what had to be done. He was capable of persuading without raising his voice, of manipulating without showing aggression. And if anyone dared to challenge him, they simply disappeared. When Riina sensed a threat, the response was immediate. Fear and death took care of the rest. One former member of Cosa Nostra would recall years later the first time he saw him. Riina was hiding in the home of a relative, far from the eyes of the police. That young man, still unaware of who that visitor was, barely realized that he was sharing a roof with the most dangerous fugitive in Italy. Years passed, and that same witness would be formally recruited by the organization. During the initiation ceremony, he met Riina under the mafia ritual that sealed loyalty with blood. That day, the boss greeted him with a sentence he would never forget. "I didn't want you to be recruited. You're in the hands of the most incompetent representative in the history of Cosa Nostra. And as soon as I can, I'll put a hole in his head." It was his way of warning that in his world there was no room for error or weakness. Totò Riina trusted no one. Only fear, obedience, and death as instruments of power. The power Riina attained did not arise out of nowhere. It was the result of decisions and silences woven within his hometown. Corleone, 60 kilometers from Palermo, preserves narrow streets and tightly packed houses, a stone labyrinth where history and custom mark every step. There, the mafia was present in a diffuse way, visible in daily life and, at the same time, difficult to pinpoint precisely. In one of those houses, Salvatore Riina grew up. His family worked the land. His childhood unfolded amid rural labor and the harshness of the countryside. His figure does not emerge from myth. It arises from the social landscape of rural Sicily at the time, a territory where formal authority frequently failed, and alternative forms of power imposed themselves through force. Those who knew him then recall everyday scenes. A young man returning home after long days of work in the fields, a town where many shared school and later life, though along different paths. Among those companions were some who would later cross the boundary, separating civilian life from criminal life. An episode etched into local memory changed the fate of the Riina family forever. Returning home one day, the father found a military device, abandoned after the passage of American troops. He believed he had found a useful resource. Material to make tools, to repair the plow, to obtain durable metal. What seemed like an opportunity would soon reveal its danger. That discovery set in motion a chain of events that pushed the family toward precariousness and survival. Material loss was the first blow. The consequences would be far greater. For the young Salvatore, those events represented a rupture that shaped his character and his view of power. The line between necessity and violence became increasingly blurred. From Corleone, an implacable ambition began to take shape. What started as adaptation to daily hardship gradually turned into absolute control over territories, economies, and human destinies. The logic of command imposed itself through force and the elimination of anyone who stood in the way. Thus was forged the man who, decades later, would consolidate an empire of blood in Sicily. Totò Riina's father believed he had found a valuable resource. That device, abandoned after the war, seemed to offer useful material for the family, durable metal to repair the tractor and make hunting cartridges. Nothing suggested the tragedy that was about to occur. In front of his house, while attempting to empty the bomb, an explosion destroyed everything. The father died, one of the brothers died, and even the draft animal that sustained their livelihood was killed. Only the young Salvatore survived, suddenly becoming the support for his pregnant mother and for the few remnants of a family that had lost everything. That explosion did not only destroy a home, it marked the birth of a mindset. From then on, survival and power would be, for Riina, matters of pure necessity. The rural setting in which he grew up was a portrait of post-war Sicily, a territory dominated by latifundia, vast tracts of land controlled by a few landowners who lived in Palermo and left authority in the hands of overseers. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk, subject to those who decided their fate with a gesture. The overseers administered labor, punishment, and even the dignity of the workers. For many, abuse was daily life, justice, a distant concept. Within that feudal structure, real power was not found in palaces or offices, but in those who knew how to impose respect, control, fear, and guarantee order in their own way. From that archaic, harsh, and unequal system, the first organized form of mafia power would emerge. It was in that environment, among wheat fields and enforced silences, that the mindset defining Totò Riina began to form. A mix of obedience, resentment, and a fierce determination never to be a victim again. In that feudal Sicily, peasants lived under the absolute rule of overseers. Men who decided who worked, who ate, and who suffered punishment. Submission was not an option. It was the only way to survive. Meanwhile, the nobles resided in Palermo, far from the sweat and dust of the fields. From the cafes of Piazza Marina, they observed their lands from a distance, without involving themselves in the lives of those who cultivated them. They expected only one thing: money. That system created the perfect ground for the rise of a parallel power. The mafia was born from that need for control, disguised as protection. The overseers, turned into intermediaries between the people and the aristocracy, began to impose their authority, shielded by the rhetoric of order. They ensured that tenants paid, that peasants did not rebel, that the honor of the lords remained intact. But over time, power changed hands. That supposed protector turned into a master. The mafia ceased to serve the landlord and replaced him, taking possession of his land, his influence, and his respect. The old nobles were dispossessed without receiving any compensation. Silently, Sicily's economic and social power shifted from the palaces to the shadows. The judicial file of Totò Riina preserves his first photograph. He was barely a boy, born in 1930. At that age, he was already listed as responsible for a homicide. During a local dispute in San Giovanni di Corleone, a confrontation between young men ended in tragedy. The adversary, Vincenzo Di Matteo, attempted to resolve the conflict with a pistol in hand. Riina responded without hesitation. He fired a single shot, hitting him in the leg. The wound was fatal. The hemorrhage ended his life within minutes. A few days later, the young man was arrested and transferred to Ucciardone prison in Palermo and later to Termini prison. He was only 19 years old. His name was already linked to violence. That crime was the first official record of a path that would lead him to become the most feared face of Cosa Nostra. The news of the killing appeared merely as a minor note in a local newspaper. The Daily Lora, of communist orientation, published a brief line. Duel between two peasants. One has died. The other is in the hospital. Nothing more. For the reporters, it was just a rural altercation. But that anonymous event would mark the beginning of one of the most feared criminal trajectories in Europe. Totò Riina, at just 19 years old, was sentenced to 12 years and 4 months in prison. Behind bars, he learned to read and write and obtained his primary school certificate. His sentence was reduced for good behavior. In 1956, he was released. He was 26 years old, with a past stained by blood and a reputation that preceded him. Corleone, his hometown, was a deeply devout place. Religiosity was not confined to the church. It was part of the social fabric. Every Holy Week, the most influential men competed for the honor of carrying the sacred images in procession. Among them were mafiosi as well, turned into symbols of respect and power. During the Good Friday procession, the figure of the Virgin walked through the town's narrow streets in search of her dead son. And when she passed in front of the houses of mafia bosses, the procession paused for a few extra minutes. The priest allowed it. The townspeople understood it. In Corleone, authority had 3 faces: the priest, the policeman, and the mafioso. They did not compete with one another. They coexisted. It was a tacit balance, a form of order accepted by all. Power did not require a uniform. Respect, fear, and the blessing of silence were enough. In Corleone, the hierarchy of power rested on 3 pillars: the priest, the policeman, and the mafioso. Each represented a different form of authority. The first blessed unions, the second guaranteed order, and the third resolved conflicts beyond the reach of the law. It was a silent balance, accepted by everyone. Faith, law, and fear coexisted in the same space. Within that context, even the men of Cosa Nostra considered themselves believers. Most had been raised under the rites of the church: baptism, communion, confession. And although they committed atrocious acts, they claimed to act for the good of the community. In their distorted logic, violence was a form of justice. One of them would explain it years later with stark honesty. After every murder, I went to church. I couldn't confess to anyone, only to God. I asked for forgiveness, and when I prayed, I felt clean. I believed the victim deserved it. That contradiction defined the essence of mafia power in Sicily. A blend of faith, guilt, and moral conviction. The same men who ordered killings went to Mass every Sunday. They prayed, made donations, took part in processions, and the people saw them as benefactors, not as criminals. Sicily has always been a land of contrasts. Isolated, proud, and marked by centuries of foreign domination, its history forged a complex relationship with authority. For generations, power came from outside. First, the Spaniards, then the Bourbons, later the Italians from the north. None managed to earn the trust of the people. In that vacuum, a different loyalty was born. Not toward the state, but toward whoever could offer justice, protection, or revenge. And within that distorted loyalty, the mafia found its strength. Throughout history, Sicily has been a land conquered time and again. Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards, each left its mark, but none allowed the island to govern itself. There was never a truly Sicilian dynasty. Power always came from outside, and with it, a distant form of justice, detached from the needs of the people. In that vacuum of authority, new figures emerged. Men who promised protection, who settled disputes, who guaranteed a form of order. They were not judges or soldiers, they were the first mafiosi. The term mafioso, in its origins, was not linked to crime. It referred to the uomo d'onore, the respected man, the mediator, the one who delivered justice where the state did not reach. In a land without solid institutions, he was long seen as a necessary evil. If a farmer was stripped of his land, he turned to him. If a family needed to resolve an offense, he intervened. Even in matters of honor, such as forced marriages or family disputes, his word carried more weight than the law. The mafioso became a symbol of paternal authority. He protected, punished, and above all, inspired respect. One former member of Cosa Nostra would explain it years later with absolute coldness. We knew everything that was going on. If someone stole, we were the ones who punished them, not because we were seeking justice, but because the order of the neighborhood depended on us. Thus was born the true structure of mafia power, a parallel justice system fueled by fear and sustained by the admiration of a people who had stopped believing in their state. During those years, mafia control reached absolute precision. Nothing happened without its knowledge. From small thefts to armed robberies, everything passed under its gaze. It was, in practice, a state within the state. In many neighborhoods, real authority did not wear a uniform. It needed no court orders or protocols. The mafioso knew who stole, who owed money, or who had betrayed a promise. And he acted swiftly, without trial or defense. For the population, this offered a false sense of security. Those who respected the rules lived in peace. Those who broke them disappeared. For a time, Palermo would wake up to black bags abandoned next to trash containers. Inside them were the bodies of those who had been warned and did not obey. Strangled, wrapped in plastic, turned into examples. That form of justice was called Lupara Bianca, the silent shotgun of the mafia. It left no witnesses and no bodies, only fear. Over time, the mafia structure of Corleone began to consolidate under an unusual figure. The first recognized boss was Dr. Michele Navarra, a respected physician with social prestige. He ran the local hospital and came from a well-off family. Beneath his appearance as an impeccable professional, he built a network of influence that extended across both civil and criminal power. At his side stood his trusted man, Luciano Leggio, a young, ambitious, violent man, determined to climb the ranks. His loyalty did not stem from respect, but from opportunity. Leggio saw in Navarra a springboard toward something greater, total control of the Corleone mafia family. From the relationship between the doctor and the killer would emerge a new era in the history of Cosa Nostra, the transition from the respectable mafia to the mafia of terror. Dr. Michele Navarra represented the old guard of Corleone. Director of the local hospital, he came from an influential family. One brother chaired the Sicilian transport company, another was rector of the Polyclinic of Messina, and a third held a seat on the regional council. It was a respected surname, a symbol of prestige, power, and connections. But in Sicily, social power and mafia power had always walked very close together. And Navarra was not satisfied with his public position. He wanted to rule within Cosa Nostra as well. In 1958, the situation changed. One of his men, Luciano Leggio, had risen rapidly within the organization. He was young, impulsive, and violent, but possessed a determination that commanded respect. Leggio believed his moment had come that the throne of Corleone should be his. The problem was simple. Only one person could occupy the boss's seat. And in the mafia, transfers of power are not negotiated, they are carried out. One summer day, Dr. Navarra's car was ambushed on a road near Corleone. A burst of gunfire put an end to his rule. The attack was swift, brutal, and final. It was never confirmed who pulled the trigger, but no one doubted the intellectual author, Luciano Leggio. With the doctor's death, the young mafioso became the new boss of Corleone. At his side were two men who would soon write their own history of terror, Salvatore Totò Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, two silent, disciplined, and lethal lieutenants who saw in Leggio not only a leader, but a model of power. The death of Dr. Navarra marked the end of the old mafia of Corleone, the one that still maintained a certain relationship with respectable society. From 1958 onward, a new generation took control. Younger, more ambitious, and far more violent. The seed of what would later be known as the dictatorship of terror had been born. Corleone was transformed into a stage of relentless violence. In just a few years, more than 50 murders were recorded linked to the faction that supported Navarra. Most were carried out by Leggio's lieutenants. The reputation of that group was built on blood. They were feared because they did not negotiate. They killed. You either reached an agreement with them or you lost your life. The local war made the front pages in Palermo. Humiliated by criticism, Leggio reacted with fury. He ordered the destruction of the printing presses of the newspaper that pointed the finger at him. Shortly afterward, the surname Riina began to appear in the headlines. Having become one of Leggio's enforcers, Salvatore Riina was starting to stand out. The police released his identification photograph, the image of a man hardened by rural life and violence. By 1958, Riina was already a fully integrated member of the organization. He knew the rules, followed them, and exploited them to his advantage. His ambition was clear. He wanted to rise. A former member summed it up bluntly when asked why he joined Cosa Nostra. In my town, I was nobody. Nobody greeted me. Since I joined, they look at me differently. I have prestige and respect. For many young men of the time, the mafia represented a path of social mobility. An illegal, criminal path, but an effective one for achieving money, power, and public recognition. Thus, a cruel logic took hold. Worth was measured by the ability to impose fear, and membership offered status and access to resources that formal society denied. For many men in Sicily, the mafia was not just a criminal organization, but a means of advancement, a shortcut to power, money, and above all, respect. In a rigid and unequal society, being part of Cosa Nostra granted a new identity, that of a man of honor. Decades later, a former member would recall his initiation. I was 22 years old. I was summoned to a remote place, along with 6 other young men. I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought they were going to punish me for some foolish thing from the past. The ritual began with a sacred image. With a needle, They pricked his finger, and the blood fell onto the paper. Then the image was set on fire and passed from hand to hand as it burned. As the fire consumed it, we repeated the oath. We would never betray the organization, and if we did, our bodies should burn like that image. Thus, a new man of honor was born. From that moment on, he ceased to be an ordinary individual. His life, his family, and his destiny were bound to the organization. In the neighborhoods, everyone understood what that meant. Before, that young man had been respected for his surname. Now, he was respected for himself. His participation in private conversations with the bosses was enough to demonstrate his new status. Becoming a man of honor was equivalent to opening one's eyes. You saw and heard what others could not. Respect turned into power, and power into fear. That ceremony, repeated over generations, was not just an oath. It was the final step into a life in which loyalty was worth more than blood. Belonging to Cosa Nostra offered concrete privileges. Those who attained the status of man of honor enjoyed advantages that ordinary society did not grant. Preferential treatment in business, access to top-level medical care, and doors that opened without questions. Respect translated into real power. An offense could be paid for with one's life. The daily life of many members was double. In the morning, the coldest routine, tasks imposed by the organization, decisions that could end in death if so ordered. When night fell, public life. A shower to erase traces, clothes handed to the family, a table at the bar with friends, an appearance of normality that concealed extreme acts. This duality was essential to the functioning of the system. The same man who committed murders could later present himself as a benefactor of the neighborhood. He lent money to those who needed it, facilitated credit, guaranteed those who wanted to open a business. In moments of crisis, he intervened to resolve problems the state did not solve. At local festivities, his contribution appeared through donations, visible support for the priest or the community. That help reinforced his public image, protector and provider. At the same time, it strengthened his control. The machinery worked as follows: generating social dependence and, with it, loyalty. That network of favors and fear ensured impunity and the continuity of influence. The dual public role of many members was deliberate. On the one hand, they acted as providers, donating to the priest, funding festivities, granting informal credit to those in need. That network of favors consolidated their social position and created dependence. On the other hand, they exercised violence when circumstances demanded it. Threats, coercion, and murder were management tools applied with the same ease as help given to the neighborhood. Internal rules were explained from initiation onward. They were strict rules, with sanctions that could reach the death penalty for those who broke them. Informing the police, maintaining relations with the family of another man of honor, or physically confronting an important member were offenses that, according to the unwritten code, required irreversible punishment. This mix of benefits and punishments formed the framework of control, social protection and repression, reward and terror. In this way, loyalty was forged and resistance silenced. Members of the organization who were imprisoned, even after arrest, retained a status that translated into privileges in penitentiaries such as Ucciardone. Prison did not always imply a total loss of power. At times, it became a new stage from which to continue operating. This chain of public favors and private violence explains why the mafia proved so difficult to eradicate. It offered immediate solutions where the state did not, and punished with brutality anyone who tried to break that circuit. At 33 years of age, Riina returned to Ucciardone prison. He had been arrested in Corleone, where he was hiding as a fugitive after the massacre that had eliminated the main members of the Navarra family. The arrest was almost accidental. Officers from the police station stopped him, and he, with complete confidence, showed a false document. He was taken to the police facility, and there he was recognized and arrested. In prison, he appeared different. He was no longer the apprentice, but a man with authority. Among the detainees, his figure commanded respect. He had ceased to be a young man without a history and had become a recognized boss. 6 years later, in 1969, a court in Apulia was chosen to handle the proceedings against Legio, Riina, and their accomplices for the murders linked to Navarra's fall. The decision caused surprise. Defense lawyers argued that Palermo did not guarantee impartiality. On the eve of the verdict, the atmosphere grew even more tense. The presiding judge received an anonymous letter threatening to blow up the building if any of the gentlemen of Corleone were convicted. Riina appeared in the dock, but media attention focused mainly on Legio, the public figure of the group. Even so, Riina's name began circulating forcefully in police reporting. His file and photograph became proof that he was no longer a simple local agitator. He was part of a leadership group that had changed the map of power in Sicily. The stage that followed placed Riina in a prominent position within the organization. The violence and cunning he displayed in those years would form the basis of his later rise. The verdict stunned all of Italy. All the Corleonesi were acquitted. However, a state prefect, aware of the danger they represented, ordered their confinement outside Sicily. The measure sought to remove them from their natural environment, but it was not a prison sentence, it was house arrest. And as expected, they escaped. They returned clandestinely to the island, protected by other mafia families. Because within Cosa Nostra, there existed an unwritten rule: the fugitive is never alone. The mafioso on the run does not flee to exotic countries or live hidden in distant mansions. He remains in Sicily, because whoever leaves his land loses power, loses respect, and in that world, that is equivalent to disappearing. That same year, 1969, an episode would mark a new escalation in violence. A group of hitmen burst into the offices of real estate developer Michele Cavataio in Palermo in broad daylight. The attack was a burst of automatic gunfire. Cavataio and several of his men were killed. According to mafia codes, Cavataio had gone too far, extending his influence beyond what was permitted. And within Cosa Nostra, that was paid for with one's life. During the clash, one of the attackers was killed, and the gunmen took his body with them to avoid leaving any trace. Years later, it became known who he was: a Bagarella, brother of Leoluca Bagarella, Totò Riina's brother-in-law. That fact revealed something important. The Corleonesi were no longer a simple family from the interior of Sicily. They had begun to play an active role in the conflicts of the powerful Palermo families. Their influence was expanding, and their name was beginning to instill fear even in the highest circles of the organization. The newspaper L'Ora published an enigmatic headline: "Hatred has patience." That attack was planned with military precision. Years later, mafia turncoats would confirm that the man who led the death squad on Viale Lazio was Salvatore Riina. The event made it clear that the old mafia guard was in decline. A new generation, violent, ruthless, and without moral codes, had taken control. Cosa Nostra operated as a pyramidal structure. At the top stood the Commission, a kind of board of directors made up of the bosses of the main Sicilian families. For years, that seat of power had been reserved for Palermo families, but at the beginning of the 1972nd, something changed. For the first time, a representative from Corleone obtained a seat at the top: Luciano Legio. That appointment confirmed what many feared. The family from that small inland town was no longer a secondary force. It had entered the very center of mafia power in Sicily. In 1971, a crime shook Italy. Prosecutor Pietro Scaglione, head of the Palermo prosecutor's office, was murdered as he was returning from the cemetery, a place he visited every morning to leave flowers on his wife's grave. 3 years before the Red Brigades kidnapped a magistrate, Cosa Nostra had already openly challenged the state. The newspaper L'Ora did not hesitate to point to Legio as the intellectual author of the attack, and to the young Salvatore Riina as its executor. The motive, according to investigators, was both personal and symbolic. Scaglione had issued a ruling that limited Leggio's freedom. It did not send him to prison, but it prevented him from returning to Corleone. That decision was taken as an affront. Breaking the rule that prohibited directly attacking the state marked a turning point. It was a message from the Corleonesi to the rest of the organization. They were willing to go further than anyone else. That same year, the police seized the fourth known photograph of Riina. It was not a police image, but a personal memento. He appeared in Piazza San Marco in Venice, alongside his wife, Ninetta Bagarella, during their honeymoon. Their story had begun years earlier, when Riina was 26 and she was barely 14. They married in secret, hidden from justice and from the world. When they were finally able to do so publicly, he was 44 and she was 32. Behind that image of an anonymous couple in a tourist setting hid the most dangerous fugitive in Italy, a man who alternated domestic life with control over a criminal machinery that had already begun to challenge the state itself. Totò Riina and Ninetta Bagarella had 4 children. All were born in a private clinic in Palermo, under their father's real surname. Meanwhile, in 1974, the Sicilian press opened its front pages with news that marked the before and after. The capture of the Corleonesi boss, Luciano Leggio. He was arrested in Milan, in a discreet apartment, where he lived with a woman and a child. He went by the name Mr. Antonio. When he was presented to photographers, he smiled arrogantly, as if the arrest were merely a temporary setback. Within the organization, suspicions arose. Some of his men believed that Riina had betrayed his boss, facilitating his capture and blocking any escape attempt. Riina himself, according to those testimonies, promised to take charge of a rescue, but never did. Leggio would spend the rest of his life in prison. And thus, without firing a single bullet, Totò Riina took his place. By 1974, he was already part of the triumvirate that controlled Cosa Nostra. Those who knew him from the inside described him in blunt terms. Riina was a born traitor. He turned fathers against sons, brothers against one another. He was like woodworm. He advanced slowly, destroying from within. He was not a politician or a diplomatic strategist. He was a pure criminal, guided by the instinct to survive and dominate. That coldness was precisely what allowed him to rise while others fell. At that same time, the power of the Corleonesi was extending even over institutions. Lieutenant Colonel Russo of the Carabinieri had thoroughly investigated the links between the mafia and public contracts for the Garcia Dam. That investigation cost him his life. Russo was murdered just a few kilometers from where he worked. His death was a clear message. Anyone who dared touch the interests of the Corleonesi would be silenced. A local councilman, interviewed shortly afterward, summed it up simply. To do something like that, you need power. And here, the mafia still has it. The colonel's death was just one more in a chain of murders that consolidated Riina's absolute power. Cosa Nostra no longer controlled only Sicily. It had begun to openly challenge the Italian state. To eliminate Colonel Russo, power was required. The power of someone who did not fear directly defying the state. That was the hallmark of Totò Riina and his lieutenant, Bernardo Provenzano. Until then, the traditional mafia had followed an unwritten rule. Do not draw attention. It infiltrated institutions, blended into business, and remained in the shadows. It did not confront the state head-on, it preferred to corrupt it. Riina and Provenzano broke with that logic. They decided to turn Cosa Nostra into an open strike force. They chose the path of armed confrontation. For the first time, the mafia stopped acting as a hidden power and began behaving like a clandestine army. In 1978, a crime confirmed that the violence of the Corleonesi was not limited to the state. In Palermo, Giuseppe Di Cristina was murdered, a member of a historic mafia family from Riesi in the province of Caltanissetta. He was an intelligent man, with influence within the old mafia structure. But he had made a mistake. He distrusted Riina. Di Cristina had sensed that something dark was taking shape. He tried to warn his allies in Palermo, about the threat posed by the new boss of Corleone. He even spoke with a carabinieri colonel, not as an informant, but as an intermediary. He wanted to warn that Riina was not just another mafioso. He was a conqueror determined to bring all of Sicily under his command. But in Sicily, warning too much is signing one's own death sentence. The Corleonesi found out. Leaks within institutions allowed them to track Di Cristina's every move. Shortly afterward, he was murdered. His body appeared riddled with bullets in Palermo. The old mafia, the one that negotiated and avoided scandal, was being replaced by a far more ruthless one. The message was clear. Anyone who did not align with Riina would have no place in the new Cosa Nostra. The era of silence had ended. The era of terror was beginning. Totò Riina had turned Cosa Nostra into a regime of fear. His ambition knew no limits. He wanted absolute control, and he knew only one way to achieve it: death. During the final years of the 1970 seconds, his strategy was clear. Eliminate any obstacle, inside and outside the organization. Terror became his instrument of command. In 1979, a chain of assassinations began that shook Italy. The first was that of journalist Mario Francese, a reporter for Il Giornale di Sicilia. Francese was not an ordinary reporter. He investigated deeply, sought causes, not headlines. He was among the first to write about the Corleonesi, pointing out their rise and their methods. That boldness cost him his life. One night, outside his home, he was gunned down. His murder marked the beginning of a new phase, total war against anyone who spoke too much. Days later, violence reached politics. The regional secretary of the Christian Democracy Party, Michele Reina, was assassinated. Reina had refused to collaborate with the economic interests of the Corleonesi. Riina decided he had to disappear. Shortly afterward, the Palermo police were also struck. The head of the mobile squad, Boris Giuliano, was murdered in broad daylight while drinking coffee. He was an experienced investigator who had begun to follow the trail of drug trafficking money. His execution was a direct declaration of war on the state. The year 1979 became etched in memory as the beginning of an unprecedented era of terror. Judges, journalists, politicians, police officers, no one was safe. And as bodies piled up, the institutional response was weak. Mass funerals, speeches of outrage, promises of action, but little real effectiveness. The mafia had understood one thing. Fear paralyzed more than bullets. The Corleonesi controlled Sicily through blood and silence. Riina was no longer just a mafia boss. He was the symbol of a power that had imposed itself over the state, the media, and society. The organization's violence did not only seek to eliminate enemies. It pursued a clear objective to extract obedience through fear. Anyone holding public office, who pushed effective measures against corruption, knew they were exposing themselves to real danger. This was not a rhetorical threat. It was a practical warning about the consequences of confronting mafia interests. When a politician tried to impose transparency in public procurement, the response could be swift and lethal. The logic was brutal and pragmatic. If it was not possible to tame or corrupt whoever stood in the way, the final solution was to eliminate them. The procedure for incorporating new executioners was deliberate and perverse. First, the novice was introduced to discussions and minor tasks. Then, in a controlled manner, he was exposed to examples of violence already carried out. Little by little, he was asked whether he had the courage to act, whether his hand would be willing to pull the trigger. And when the final test arrived, it was no longer a matter of observing. He was forced to participate, to keep watch, to accompany, to turn fear into action until death was normalized as a tool of command. Thus, a chain of obedience was forged that required no written orders. Direct experience, the completion of a violent act, and shared complicity were enough to keep the system running. Violence gradually became routine. New initiates learned to kill as one learns a trade, without questions, without remorse. For many, the original act taking a life eventually lost its moral weight. It acquired the coldness of just another task, comparable to bringing down a piece of game. A confessing witness described how, over time, he stopped thinking. The system carried him along. Repetition, group pressure, and the need to belong erased reflection. He moved like someone wearing blinders, focused solely on carrying out orders. We went, we killed. We didn't think about it for even 2 minutes, he would recall. The virtue valued by the organization was not asking questions. Obedience was the measure of worth. One of the first images that struck Palermo's photographers remained in the collective memory. A murdered young man, seated, his face destroyed. The scene seemed theatrical in its brutality. Reporters dubbed it the Two Christs. Two motionless figures, one atop the other, beneath the sheet. The scene showed no visible blood at first glance, yet conveyed an almost sculptural violence, cold and deliberate. The real motive behind so many crimes was always the same: power. The mafia killed to protect interests, accumulate wealth, and consolidate control. In Sicily, a brutal saying circulated that summed it up bluntly: command stood above any other human experience. That prioritization of command over human life transformed the organization. What began as territorial control became a regime that ruled through terror, and its cost was, quite literally, incalculable. Mafia power had always rested on a fixed idea: total domination. It was not just money or territory. It was absolute control over the lives of others. For decades, photographers and chroniclers who documented that period described it with a phrase repeated to exhaustion: blood upon blood, pain upon pain. The mafia killed anyone who stood in its way. And under Riina's command, that principle became an unbreakable law. The murder of regional president Piersanti Mattarella did not quench Riina's thirst for power. 5 months later, in Monreale, while the city was celebrating the Feast of the Crucifix, the capo's hitmen attacked amid the crowd. The target was Captain Emanuele Basile, an officer of the Carabinieri. They murdered him in front of his daughter, in broad daylight. Basile had taken charge of the investigation into public contracts and the Garcia Dam, an investigation initiated by Colonel Russo. He had signed his own sentence. Riina understood that his rise within Cosa Nostra could only be sustained through fear. Each new crime was a warning to everyone else. At that time, he believed that a show of force would be enough for the other families to accept his leadership. He thought terror would suffice to impose respect and avoid a war. But he was wrong. Discontent was growing among the Palermo bosses. Stefano Bontade, Salvatore Inzerillo, and Gaetano Badalamenti, figures of the old Cosa Nostra, were convinced that Riina had to be eliminated. They planned to do it with honor, following the rules of the organization, to convene a meeting of the Sicilian Commission and execute him there. However, Riina always stayed one step ahead. An infiltrated informant warned him of the plot. And when the bosses summoned him, Riina simply did not show up. That gesture would mark the beginning of the Mafia War. April 1981. Palermo would become a battlefield. And Totò Riina, the son of a farmer from Corleone, was about to become the absolute dictator of Cosa Nostra. The blood of a single man would be enough to ignite the most violent war in the history of the Sicilian Mafia. April 1981. The balance within Cosa Nostra was definitively shattered. Stefano Bontade, one of Palermo's most respected bosses, had underestimated Totò Riina. While he trusted the old rules of honor, Riina had already decided that only violence would guarantee his power. Bontade's murder was swift, precise, planned with surgical accuracy. Striking the strategist first was essential. Without his leadership, his army would collapse. And that is exactly what happened. With his death, the internal order of the Sicilian Mafia began to disintegrate. Just days later, the next target was Salvatore Totuccio Inzerillo, an ally and close friend of Bontade, a key figure in the plot to eliminate Riina. The information came from within his own family. The Corleonesi had managed to infiltrate one of their own. Inzerillo went confidently to a meeting with a woman. A van was waiting for him in the street. When he stopped, the hitman opened fire. He died on the spot. The message was brutal and calculated. No blood tie or hierarchy would protect the enemies of Corleone. But the violence did not end there. Inzerillo's son, a young man consumed by rage, swore to avenge his father. Riina ordered his capture. He was taken to a livestock pen in the Santa Maria di Gesù neighborhood. What happened there became one of the most atrocious scenes in the history of the Sicilian Mafia. The animals had gone days without food. Riina's men cut off his arm while he was still alive. "With this arm you wanted to kill the boss," they told him. Then they threw the bloodied limb to the pigs, and finally, the young man himself. After that, Palermo turned into a human hunt. Every day dawned with new bodies. 2, 3, 5 murders. Streets, cars, and vacant lots became scenes of relentless executions. The so-called Mafia War was not a power struggle. It was a systematic purge to wipe out anyone who opposed Riina's rule. In just a few months, the Corleonesi seized Sicily through fear, betrayal, and blood. Palermo became a hunting ground. The victims almost always belonged to the defeated side. The violence was unilateral and systematic. Whoever received the warning arrived first. Whoever arrived first carried out the sentence. Traitors and informants facilitated the lists. They warned, pointed out, and handed over targets. The attackers acted without exposing themselves. In the improvised headquarters of the Corleonesi, everything functioned with the coldness of a routine. Someone cooked, another organized supplies, another prepared the vehicles. When a tip arrived, they got into the cars and went straight to the mission. For many participants, it stopped being something exceptional. The sense of efficiency and the recognition within the organization turned action into a test of worth. The numbers are staggering. Hundreds of dead in just a few years, around 150 in 1981, and a similar figure in 1982. The massacre spread beyond the province, reaching other regions where men marked by Riina's opponents were also executed. That visible violence was only part of the process. There was another, more discreet form of elimination. The so-called Luparabianca executions that left no remains. Disappearances that turned spouses into widows without bodies. Victims who troubled Riina were taken to places later known as death chambers, spaces where they were killed and made to disappear without leaving a trace. The island paid an immense price. Streets, vacant lots, and the interiors of vehicles filled with corpses. The violence left a deep mark on society. Fear, shifts in loyalty, and the certainty that opposing meant exposing oneself to disappearance. The machinery of death, imposed by Totò Riina, reached chilling levels of precision. The practice of making bodies disappear, known as Luparabianca, was perfected under his command. The so-called death chambers multiplied throughout Palermo. Each family had its own space to execute and eliminate those who got in the way, whether mafiosi or merely inconvenient witnesses. They were hidden, austere, functional places. In many of them there was a swivel chair, like a dentist's, a nearby bathtub, and hooks driven into the walls. There, prisoners were interrogated, strangled, and then dissolved in acid. The remains were dumped into the sea through pipes, erasing all traces of the crime. One of the repentant mafiosi would later recall the details with chilling detachment. Strangling was not easy, he said, but in a group, it was quick. When the body relaxed, it betrayed the end. The smell indicated that life was gone. Thus, the cycle of violence was closed. There were no witnesses, no bodies, no burials, only the certainty of fear. On the 30th of November 1982, the internal mafia war reached its final point. That day, Salvatore Riina eliminated Salvatore Riccobono, one of the last bosses who still resisted his dominance. The meeting was planned, with the calm of someone who knows he has already won. Riina invited Riccobono to lunch. They shared the table, talked with apparent cordiality. After lunch, while the guest rested, Riina lunged at him and strangled him with his own hands. His bodyguards met the same fate. All were dissolved in acid, like so many others before them. With that act, Totò Riina sealed his absolute power. From that day on, no one by good means or bad dared to contradict him. The son of the farmer from Corleone had become the undisputed dictator of Cosa Nostra. Totò Riina achieved the goal he had set for himself in his youth, to become the capo dei capi, the boss of all bosses. He achieved it, and he boasted about it. He said that sooner or later, his name would appear in history books. And so it did. He entered them, though for the darkest reasons. His life, far from the myth, became empty. The man who had ruled Sicily with blood lived shut within himself. Without friends, without walks, without family. Only work, orders, and death. Every morning, he went out to deal with the organization's affairs. Internal disputes, business, punishments, executions. Nothing lay outside his control. From public contracts to drug trafficking, everything passed through his approval. In 1982, he ordered the assassination of Communist Deputy Pio La Torre, author of a law that allowed the confiscation of mafia assets. It was his way of warning the state. The government's response was to send Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, a general of the Carabinieri and a hero of the fight against terrorism. He arrived in Palermo with a mission, to stop Riina. 100 days later, he, his wife, and his escort were riddled with bullets by direct order of the boss. The message was unequivocal. In Sicily, the mafia ruled. Riina went from being a farmer with no future to dominating a criminal organization capable of defying an entire country. His legacy was fear. The price, thousands of lives. Today, his name does not represent power, but the memory of the horror that Cosa Nostra left in Italy. A reminder of how far ambition can go when it knows no limits. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of this story. If this history has interested you and you want to continue exploring the secrets, betrayals, and names that shape the world of organized crime, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your opinion in the comments. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that few dare to tell.